Some 25 years ago, at a festival, I saw Shahika Tekan's staging of Beckett's play, The Play. For those who may not remember, the text involves an emotional triangle, a man and two women, each stuck in a large urn on stage, visible only from the neck up. Whomever the spotlight falls on is the one who speaks like in an interrogation. The response to light is immediate, as Beckett writes on stage directions. They have their own parts to tell, their monologues. The man has a hiccup problem and often hiccups while he's speaking. When Shaika Tekant staged this play, she expanded it from 3 characters to 9 and in some versions to 15. On stage, we saw 9 squares, each containing a performer. Each square had its own light, like a little bulb in it, and when a particular square lit up, that performer would speak. So we had 3 lovers, 3 wives, and 3 husbands, with monologues rapidly flowing between them. The threes were sometimes acting simultaneously as one and sometimes divided up the lines. Beckett's piece was performed and reperformed 3 times in succession, each iteration faster than the last. When we reached the final round, the speed was almost unbearable. The lights, the cue, absolute darkness and silence against sharp, full exposure and speech. Here we see an excerpt from the last round of a 15 actors version.
O zaman biz şimdi...
Evet, orada, hepsi orada. Gözüne giriyor. Göreceksin. Çekil üzerimden. Çekil üzerimden. Çekil. Çekil üzerimden. İnanamam.
Biz şimdi...
We could barely understand the words. They were splitting even a single hiccup among actors, and yet the flow was so hypnotic, so flawless that we held our breath, not just because of what we saw, but because of what could go wrong. The tension was exquisite. We were gripped by the fear that even the smallest slip might shatter that perfection, that clockwork precision. After the performance, the director and actors came on stage for a Q&A. We asked how they managed the lighting cues, given the precision and risk involved. We all assumed there must be some automated lighting system. Instead, Tekant, the director, brought out the lighting technician, who showed us that it was all done manually with a simple board of 9 switches. He was making them on and off, no automation at all. The audience was astonished and asked why the staging would run such a risk, leaving room for errors, for misentrances. Tekkan's answer stayed with me all these years. She said, because theater is all about humans, and humans are errant. Thinking the emotional, mental, and physical vulnerability of human beings, the actor's body is not a violin that a violinist must care for. Actors' openness to the limitless effects of any given moment on the stage creates the uniqueness of each performance. It is not about a polished, authentic replication of reality, but rather about the live, breathing moment shared between performers and audience. In that staging, the text, its representation, its perception, its criticism, embodiment, all these rehearsals, memorizations, repetitions, physicality, characters, roles, acting, and presence were all there. Hard work, artificiality, fictionality, design, but still liveness. What we encountered was indeed a theater performance. Liveness is one of the direct outcomes of presence, and it has nothing to do with realness or authenticity, but the experience, the flow, the joy, the fear. May I say, the fear of falling? Because I think the subtext of every performance is the fear of falling. I will take this Beckett performance as the foundation for what I want to say about presence. But this fear of falling isn't just an abstract concept for me right now. As you can tell, English isn't my first language, so this written text I read now is my safety net against the fear of falling, and in a Brechtian gesture, I wanted to underline and point to this rather than covering it. For me, thinking, thought, like art, is only truly liberated when it's conscious of its own artifice, its own design. For a long time, there has been a widespread assumption in the world of contemporary performance. If there is representation, if there is theatricality, if there is fictionality, if we perceive even a light shade of design, then there cannot be presence. But art is always bound to artificiality. Artificial means of or belonging to art. It is not naturally occurring, but made by humans. It is not an occurrence or happening, but a design. To claim that the artificial excludes presence is to deny the very condition of art. And also, representation already contains presence. Etymologically, representation is the act of making something present again. To represent is to bring back, to reoffer, to recall, to make visible or tangible once more. I always thought that there is a very immense layered presence in theater performance. Let's say I've been cast to play Gertrude in Hamlet. We see Gertrude speaking to Hamlet about her worries, placing her hand on her heart in more physical terms, touching her chest. At that moment, there are, in fact, three chests being touched. The first is my own chest, as Beliz, who might be worried about her unpaid rent. The second chest belongs to the actor, who might be anxiously wondering whether her fellow performer will forget his line again. And the third belongs to Gertrude, who is sincerely concerned that her son will never stop grieving his father's death. These layers always juxtapose as long as I'm on stage and the play goes on. When Gertrude exists, she will go to her bedroom, walking through the unseen of stage corridors of Elsinore, while the actor is smoking and waiting in backstage for her next entrance. Or in a death scene, Gertrude and I lying on the stage, she's so dead, but I will rise as soon as I hear the applause, because the performance is over. This layered simultaneity, this dense existence of overlapping multiple presences, is something we never find in real life. If you're looking for presence, you're not going to find it in the daily life where all the world is a store, but in theater where all the world is a stage. It is one of the things I love most about theater, and one reason for my deep appetite for theater theory. Most art forms are either performative, like a violinist playing a Bach solo, or representational, like a painting. Only theater and opera, I believe, consist of both. On the stage, there are always at least dual beings for every component of theater, for character, for time, for space. Literally, it is the wooden floor I stand on as an actor and as Billy's, and metaphorically, it is the whole of Elsinore Palace. These two layers, the performative and the representational, the literal and the metaphorical, interact in ways that create a short circuit, producing the energy of liveness. Why do I say a short circuit? The performative layer demands that I must be the sole carrier of the action, because I am the performer and nothing should be more important than I am. But the representational layer simultaneously wants me to step back so that I become just one of the components of the overall representational project. As an actor, I'm no more important than the light, the sound, the costume, the rhythm of the play, or Shakespeare's words. Am I to step forward as the star of the night, or to recede and serve humbly as one cog in the vast mechanism of theater? To be or not to be? That really is the question and the problem because this creates an ontological crack. And we love that crack. That's why theater theory is so dialectical. It never speaks in pure states of being. It exists in the tension, the unresolved paradoxes, the shifting thresholds between what is represented and what is performed. To mention these points may sound like stating the obvious for most of us, or some of us, but this is what I try to remind. When we speak of presence, we often forget the extraordinary ontological density that theatrical forms sustain. And why is that tendency to forget theater and turn to modern performance art, although it's ontologically flat when we're speaking about presence? Now, I need to show how performance art redeems from this multidimensionality by discarding the representational layer to strengthen presence. Discarding the representational layer meant to get rid of playtext, of representing a story, a performer casting a character, and how the strategy was built on defeating the theater. In a 1992 lecture, Richard Schechner, somewhat hastily declared and proclaimed the paradigm of performance. I quote, "The fact is that theater, as we have known and practiced it, the staging of written dramas, will be the string quartet of the 21st century, a beloved but extremely limited genre, a subdivision of performance." I'm not sorry to say that after more than 30 years, his prediction hasn't been realized. The performance art casts theater as its other, often a rival or even an enemy to be challenged, displaced, or conquered. In this struggle, presence became the antidote to theater's perceived artificiality. It is mediation, its reliance on repetition. And as a side effect of this war, when two paradigms really confront each other, they start to shift. They influence each other, they change. They're no longer what they were at the start. Most likely, performance art, instead of leaving theater into oblivion, renewed it with more embodiment and more physicality. At the birth of performance art, presence emerged as a stance against the representational regime of theater. So, in those heydays, presence wasn't a neutral term, it was polemical, especially for the pioneering performance artists of the 1960s and 70s. While happenings were the most attractive form of contemporary art, texts, the artificiality of roles, characters, and dramatic structures were all seen as masks, as obstacles to presence. To some extent, the criticism was valuable. It sounded radical and revolutionary against that forms of representation. It was vital and invigorating to ponder our 2,500-year-old theater within new terms, with that new perspective generated by performance theory. But this is important. Marvin Carson states that typical performance art is solo art and adds, its practitioners, almost by definition, do not base their work upon characters previously created by other artists, but upon their own bodies, their own autobiographies. In this context, presence meant the immediate, authentic, genuine self being on stage. In solo performances, the performer is considered the pure self of the artist. This pure self to be presented has almost become an ethical issue. Remember The Death of the Author by Roland Barthes. The peak aim of art became reaching authenticity, and this could only be redeemed by discarding the text with all its components. Immediacy was the key strategy, and to understand it better, I translate immediacy as pure presence, and of course, pure presence is only an idea, a concept, only has validity in theory, in thinking, as with all the other purities. Possible to think of, but impossible to do. It is like imagining a circle with corners. I can understand the idea, but it's impossible to draw what I have in my mind. So, what remained from those hot days of theory? Unlike performance arts exalting presence as the antithesis of representation, theater, good theater, shows us that presence and representation are not alternatives to be chosen. What else remained from those days? We encounter the proliferation and frequency of solo performance forms in stand ups, in queer autobiographic monologues, in pieces written for a solo performer in theatrical form. I think this points to the second crucial moment of performance art. This is where presence calcified into doctrine. What began as a critic hardens into rawism, a mood that pursues the unfiltered and the confessional for affect, which eats away the vital difference between reality and fiction and art. How I would define art is the idea and practice of design. That's why what I call rawism is not an art, but a mood. I believe that it's mainly shaped by digital immediacy and neoliberal self performance. It became the hatred of fiction, anything designed, anything represented. In literature, it is autofiction. The impression it gives something like, uh, it's not made, but happened. I will quote My Struggle by Karl O. Knausgaard, in which we read writers' days of writing, with his wife, children, and friends and things around. And I can't stop asking, would the profound impact of my struggle on its readers be diminished if they were to learn that the narrative's claim to absolute truth is a literary device? Isn't that close to the feeling of the viewers of a reality TV show being deceived? Let's read. Just the thought of fiction, just the thought of a fabricated character in a fabricated plot made me feel nauseous. I reacted in a physical way. Over recent years, I had increasingly lost faith in literature. I read and thought, this is something someone has made up. Made up people in a made up, though realistic, world. It was a crisis. I couldn't write like this. It wouldn't work. Every sentence was met with the thought. But you're just making this up. It has no value. Fictional writing has no value. The only genres I saw value in, which still conferred meaning, were diaries and essays, the types of literature that did not deal with narrative, that were not about anything, but just consisted of a voice, the voice of your own personality. I coined the term rawism also from Knausgaard. He calls his own writing in the very same book as raw, and a sense of unrefined, direct, without metaphors or other linguistic decoration, he says. But metaphor is not a linguistic decoration, it's a cognitive process. But I'll come back here later. I want to ponder on the desire for authenticity in autofiction and how it is in accordance with a culture of immediacy on platforms such as Instagram, selfies, instant messages, spontaneous stories, snapshots from everyday life. All seem to promise raw reality. Yet this reality is reshaped by the algorithmic representational regimes of the platform itself. This raw writing of autofiction against fiction, like performance against theater, is everywhere. Everyone writes and reads autofiction. And in this algorithmic world, do we exactly know why people like it? How can we be sure that what we love about autofiction is truly our own choice? Isn't it even harder to define the self in an algorithmic world? A human being is made up not only what they love, but also what they reject. But if those likes and dislikes are being shaped by algorithms, then what kind of self are we really talking about? If this process drags us into clusters and echo chambers with others who are grouped the same way, then no matter how personal an autofiction writer's account seems, it will resonate within that cluster, and everyone will say or think, yes, that's me. I could have written this book myself. This also helps explain why so many people today respond with such thin skinned aggressiveness, why everything is taken so madly personally. It becomes nearly impossible to talk about or criticize anything. If someone loves Knausgaard or autofiction, then any criticism of Knausgaard feels like a personal attack because of that over intensified sense of sameness. We now inhabit what I call the presence tense, a cultural tense that privileges monologue over dialogue and immediacy over reflection. The result is a collapse between art and life where fiction's generative distance disappears. This aesthetic turn mirrors a political one. Under the faltering sign of representational democracy, the image of the individual eclipses the possibility of coexisting subjects. There seems to be a tremendous sense of disillusionment with the parliamentary system across the world. We don't know why the people who are supposed to represent us are the ones chosen to do so. Why them? How exactly do they represent us? Which of us do they stand for? Questions like these have made the very concept of representation itself seem suspect. The parliamentary system seems to be drifting towards its own end. Perhaps it has already transformed beyond recognition. Elections are no longer trusted anywhere in the world. This broader crisis has also reshaped the arts. Feeling an impulse to escape from the very idea of representation. But neither in art nor in politics directness is possible. There is always a structure, an organization, a form, a frame, in other words, representation. This is also why, in my writing workshops, probably I almost instinctively resist the overuse of the I voice, the endless foregrounding of the self. Of course, each of us is also shaped by the age we live in. To be entirely free from it is impossible. But it is equally important to remember that we are also defined by how we resist. We are carried along in a system that has convinced us that everyone is absolutely unique and important. Yet, paradoxically, it is precisely here that individuality is most hollowed out. It is only in resistance, in pushing back, that individuation happens. Human understanding is relational. It works by likening one thing to another or the new to the familiar. That's how we learn and how we give meaning. In my experience, the only way to think about something, to theorize it, is to turn it into a model that can be viewed from the outside. Theorizing, for this reason, always means theatricalizing. That's to transform something into a model that you can sit before and watch, as if it were theater. For Heidegger, Theoria means viewing or seeing from afar. Theater and theory share this Greek root theia, meaning seeing. So both have a looking that opens beings to unconcealment, aletheia. They are both ways of being outside. Theoria is a kind of attentive beholding. I began with an anecdote. Let me finish with another. I will perhaps never forget the day I first saw a globe. I was in primary school. Our teacher placed it on a desk in front row. "This is the earth we live on," she said. Then, in pairs, we all lined up for a closer look at it. I was scared to touch it, but my seatmate spun it around on its axis with slaps. Looking at the spinning sphere, I felt the ground shifting beneath me. Everything seemed to whirl in circles. I clung to the desk. My palm was drenched in sweat. The situation, which an adult might diagnose as mistaking the sign for reality, had physically made me vomit. Yet, holding the world in my hands and truly understanding it for the first time meant grasping it physically and mentally at the same time. Now, while thinking back, it seems odd and natural at the same time for the glob scene to cause a mental earthquake. The knowledge that we live on a globe spinning on its axis tends to evaporate through the daily observations of a child. Yet it was grasped with a terrifying, perhaps overwhelming power while looking at a cheap, human made miniature of it that could be considered a toy. Even a metaphor of the world I'm actually living in. It's not the world itself, it just looks alike. Because in metaphor, likeness exists only through difference, still creates a clear understanding. One of the essential features of metaphor is that it works under the proviso similar but never identical. The two things brought into comparison are never measured against each other in all aspects or every property. To produce a metaphor is to accept, at some level, a deviation, an incommensurability. For example, when speaking to a couple who fear that their children might be traumatized by witnessing a disturbing scene, I might reassure them by saying that children are a little like Teflon. My listeners would correctly grasp the metaphor. Not everything sticks to the children. Some experiences slide off. But this does not mean that children are easy to wash or that a quick rinse makes them spotless. The point of the metaphor is limited to the resemblance intended, not to every possible property. It creates the mental image I need to clarify. It is watchable in mind's eye. So, what truly revealed the truth of the world to me wasn't to live in it, but to see its hollow, plastic model, its representation, its metaphor. Metaphors are relational understanding models. We are very well aware that anything in organic natural life is unique. Among the 117 billion who have lived and died, and 8.1 billion alive today, no two people were the same. Not a feeling, not a gesture, not even a sentence repeated twice with exact same feelings or facial expressions. But we cannot cope with this plurality. That's why we need to group, categorize, or name things whenever we need them. We need to create similarities. And these similarities are temporary, local, subjective, and flexible. Uniqueness is given, similarity is made by our gaze, just as the meaning of life is made, not found. This implies that we cannot know anything purely in and of itself. It is like the impossibility of grasping truth in an isolated, singular reality, or of a person knowing themselves in their own solitude. Odysseus comprehends the most arduous years aspects of his struggle only when he sees them narrated, represented before him. If there's any chance that I can recognize myself, it is not in my isolated singularity, but in my kinship with my fellow human beings, in my representations, I may say. The alternative is a dense loneliness in which no single mind believes it needs others. A loneliness that produces a chosen, blind darkness. I think it's vital to understand that living, understanding, or making meaning are not solo performances. They are not about selves. We cannot rely on self. It is impossible to define, and it is very easy to lose the sense of. This highlights once more the importance of models in understanding complexities. The reality is complex, the self is complex, and there is no perfect point of perspective for us to see and grasp them. This prosaic and mundane daily life is chaotic. From where I stand, I cannot know the reason of this or that. I live it as linear. This is why we need fiction, the fictional universe. Fiction is not real, but a spherical model of it. A design, a fictional, a theatrical design, creates a cosmos from that chaos we call life or reality. And since ancient Greeks, the sphere has meant fulfillment. That's how I give meaning to the world, through fiction, through their grounding elements as metaphors, through temporary models of permanent truths. Each era shapes its own mind. We are in the harvest season of liberal capitalism. Its algorithmic system raises the individual as a subject while clinging obsessively to personal data. It dictates our choices and steers the very decisions through which we construct our identities. It is grouping us with people we would not choose and converting us into consumer segments. Each choice we make comes with a vast package, not just a cup or a book, but an entire identity, a social circle, a language, a set of concepts, a dream, an ideology. Its pulling is so strong that we are swept along like a dust in the wind, unable to lift our heads. We can no longer see the coordinates of where we're placed or predict where we might end up. Not a minute to understand what we're facing. When we are aware of the drift, we get frightened. We're terrified by the enormous speed. We need an anchor to slow this current, to give us a moment to look around. An anchor that will grip the seabed and slow our drift. Here comes my modest proposal. All fiction, all theater forms a universe with its multidimensional, layered presence. I say universe, a sphere, a graspable sphere that leads to understanding as a model, as a metaphor. Watching from the outside will make us think. We'll look at our unorganized thoughts in an organized, designed, readable, intelligible form. That's something life itself or its reported forms, as in autofiction, never gives. All fiction, all the metaphorical universes have a magnetic field. I mean, they're created by drawing together things that are far apart, like a simple metaphor does. It produces similarity where none was expected. Metaphor throws a bridge across distance. Here comes the good news. Algorithm and metaphor are alike. So I can say, in this algorithmic era, metaphor has camouflage. So it will survive and work without being noticed and destroyed. How are they alike? What does algorithm do? It also produces similarity. It groups, but it collapses difference into sameness. It erases distance, treating partial likeness into total equivalence. Metaphor says it is similar, but not the same. Algorithm says it is the same because it is similar. Sameness flattens the humane world. It's all dead. That's why we need fiction, theater, and representation. It preserves the distance, the not sameness that makes imagination possible, that makes us alive and fully present here in the world. Thank you for your patient presence.